Governor Mike Huckabee, thank you for coming on our show.
Well, great to be with you, Bjarte, and I'm delighted to be able to share a few thoughts. I wish we could be in person, but I think COVID has killed a lot of in-person visits for many people across the world.
That's right. Last time you were speaking to a Norwegian audience, you were at the Oslo Symposium 2017. What was that like, and how have you been?
That was an amazing experience for me. It was my I guess, first opportunity to spend a few days in Norway and really enjoy the people, the culture, the extraordinary hospitality. It was cold, however. That was one thing that it was hard for me. I live in Florida now, and so I'm used to warmer weather, but it was beautiful. And the only thing that surpassed the natural beauty of Norway was the extraordinary hospitality and vivaciousness of the Norwegian people. My wife and I have been able to return since. We'd like to come back one of these days when COVID is allowing people to travel freely. But that symposium was very special because it was able to highlight people who have made great contributions to particularly religious freedom in our world, something that I'm afraid people are losing sight of and maybe not fully appreciating the value, even to people who are not religious. The ability for people to think freely, speak freely, believe freely is at the very heart of true liberty.
When you were here, the president had just been sworn in, and you made the case for why he was the right man at the right time. What are your thoughts now, looking back 3.5 years later?
Well, I still believe that, even more so. In fact, he has surprised me in the level of keeping the promises that he made. Let me give a few examples. He said he would cut taxes for American working people. He did. It was an instant pay raise for most every American family, and even more so for the people at the bottom of the economy. So basically, every American got a pay raise of $2,500 or more. That was huge. That's money that stimulates the economy. He deregulated a lot of government. This is important because in a business environment, businesses that spend so much time filling out government paperwork are unable to do their core business. So the deregulation cut 7 regulations for everyone that started. That was huge. Then on the global scene, this is a president who's done some remarkable things. For example, he pushed back against NATO countries that weren't fully funding what they promised they would. So the United States was paying a disproportionate share of NATO. He was widely criticized for being so blunt, but here's the net result. These countries that had not been paying up what they were obligated to pay started paying. And now NATO is much stronger than it was, which means that all across the North Atlantic, there is a greater level of security because the president simply shamed some of these countries into ponying up what they should have been paying. On the other side of the globe, the president's pushback against China is underappreciated. China has been cheating in trade. They've been lying to the world about what they were up to. Their surveillance, their invasion of people's privacy across the planet, the violations of human rights within their own country, the fact that they've stolen so many of the intellectual properties that people across the world have created, and then China would pirate those products and sell them in a cheap way and compete against the originals. This is a president who said, we're going to stop that. Now, to be honest, there have been an enormous number of people, including many American big corporations, that have not been pleased with this because they were making billions of dollars in these trade agreements that were circumventing American workers, circumventing American ingenuity. And for that matter, we could say the work and ingenuity of people all across the globe, even in Norway, where people come up with ideas, they work hard, they develop those, and then China steals them and turns around and sells them for a fraction of what they're actually worth. So that's another way in which I think the president has been very effective. Let me mention two other very important things for many of us who are Christian believers. One is this president's very strong and clear message and action on the sanctity of human life. Quite frankly, we've never had a president who has done more, not just talked it, but actually done more to protect innocent, unborn human life than President Trump. And on another front, his actions with Israel have been stunning. After 26 years of presidents promising to move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is the eternal capital of the Jewish people, this president did it. And he did it in face of world opposition, people begging him not to. They said the world would catch fire. It would be a total disaster. Well, he did it, and the disaster never happened. In fact, people realized, well, why not? And I'm so proud of him for doing that. I will tell you, I was in the White House just about 2 weeks after he had made the decision and announced he would be moving the embassy. And I asked him point blank, I said, Mr. President, I'm curious because so many people were telling you not to do it. Your own staff, a lot of your own diplomats, the State Department, and every world leader were telling you not to. Why did you do it? And Bjarte, he was so clear. He just said this. Well, I said I was going to do it, and it was the right thing to do. To be honest, I found that so refreshing that it wasn't like he was wringing his hands and saying, oh, I don't know whether to do this or not. I just don't know, but I'll go ahead and try it. He just said, no, I said I was going to do it, and it's the right thing to do. I found that refreshing.
Why do you think it is that America is so divided around this election?
Well, you got to remember that the people on the left have never accepted the results of the 2016 election. So a lot of the polarization and the demonization of President Trump has happened because in 2016, they were so confident that they were going to win, that Hillary was going to be the president. And when Donald Trump upset the political establishment, they have been in an outright rage ever since. And one thing after another has been these, to borrow a phrase, trumped up charges, everything from Russia collusion, which turned out to be not true. It turned out there was Russia collusion, but now we're finding out that it was Hillary Clinton's campaign who was engaged in it. And it was carried out with people from the highest levels of the American government, from the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Justice. These are really frightening things for those of us who value a rule of law. But part of the polarization has come, I think it's deeper than just the loss of the election. It's a clash of culture, a clash of understanding who we are as a civilization. Whether or not we are one nation under God, whether or not we are a God-centered civilization or a self-centered civilization. And I would say, and I hope I don't offend any of your viewers, but I don't think all of this is political, racial, economic, social. I think it's spiritual. I think the real battle is a spiritual battle between those on the side of believing that America was blessed by God, that its founders trusted in God, looked to God, and those who believe that we are a completely secular society. It's a conflict between people who believe that what makes America a unique place is the individual versus those who believe America is basically a collection of groups. Let me be a little more specific. I believe America was founded on the notion that our liberties are individual, that my freedom is personal to me. It was not given to me by my government. It was given to me by God, and the government's job is simply to protect it, preserve it, and let me pass it on. The other option is I'm a statist. I believe that the state owns my freedom, and the state tells me what I can and cannot do. It sets the parameters of my liberty and gives me limitations of where I can go, what I can say, what I can get away with. That's a fundamentally different worldview. That's what I think is at the heart of this, is whether or not I am who I am because God made me as an individual, or I am who I am because I'm male, or I'm white, or I'm Southern, or I belong to a union, or I'm a property owner. What group do I have? So it's identity politics based on groups, or it's the self identity of being a free person with individual liberty and accountable ultimately to God. That's really what I would say is the crux, and that's a spiritual conflict. It's not just political.
The president gets a lot of bad press in America. I assure you there's more abroad. What is it that we do not understand about the president and what goes on in America?
The biggest thing you don't understand, perhaps, across the rest of the globe is that the information you get about the president is over 93% negative. The American press, and I think for that matter, the world press, hates this president. They don't just dislike him, they hate him. And part of the reason they hate him is because he is a disruptor. He has disrupted the insider's game of Washington. Frankly, it's what I find most refreshing about him. He doesn't play the game because he doesn't have to. He's the first president in my lifetime who got there without having been completely a wholly owned subsidiary of all of the major multinational corporate interests whose contributions were really the pathway for him to arrive. He got there because he paid his own way. He even gives his salary away to charity, so he didn't even take the salary of the president. Well, this makes him, again, a disruptor and an outlier for some of those who just want Washington to be run in a neat little way of insiders. And I would remind people that there are four big, what I call pressure centers in the United States. New York and the financial community, Silicon Valley and the tech community, Hollywood and the entertainment industry, and Washington, the political insider class. Those four institutions are basically all in lockstep with each other, and they live to preserve their sense of power and prestige and importance. Someone like Donald Trump comes in, he doesn't care what they think. He actually is making policy that is good for that working man, working woman that is not a celebrity. And the irony is he is a celebrity. He's a billionaire. You would think that he would be a part of the club, but he's not. And they hate him for that. So the negative news coverage across the world is just so unbelievably biased. The thing I would say singularly about President Trump that people just don't get is that he is a man, yes, he can be vulgar, he can be vain, he can be all of those things, but he's also a very decent person in terms of his generosity toward others. He has a bigger than life sense of humor. A lot of the things that he says that people are so offended by, he's honestly saying them as a way of poking fun and being funny. But they don't get the joke because they are the joke. And that's unfortunate, I think.
There has been a lot of focus around the Supreme Court nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. Why do you think she is the right pick, and why is that such a big deal?
I was so impressed with her during the Senate confirmation hearings last week. I knew she was brilliant, and I've heard a lot of wonderful things about her, this mother of 7 children, 2 of whom are African-American children adopted from Haiti, 7 of her own, 1 of whom is a special needs child. So we knew she was a remarkable mother and person. But when I heard her in the challenging environment of a Senate confirmation hearing, basically just destroy every attempt to take her down, I realized that she has a legal mind and an analytical mind, the likes of which I don't think we've seen in a long time, certainly not somebody going to the Supreme Court. She was absolutely brilliant. And she showed such a clear understanding of the American law, of what her job and the role of the judiciary is, and quite refreshingly, what the judiciary is not supposed to be. And let me be specific. For many years, the problem that the American judiciary has had is that it has believed itself to be a legislative body, correcting things the legislature should have done. But in the American system of government, there are three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. They're equal. One is not more powerful than the other, but we have allowed the court to act as if it was superior to the other two branches, and it would come out with a ruling, and people would bow to it and say, oh, there they are. It's the law of the land. But it wasn't. They can't make the law. Only the legislature can make it. So what the court should have done is to say, this is how the law should be, and then push it back to the Congress and say, Congress, you should do this. But it's still Congress's decision as the elected representatives of the people to decide whether they agree. You don't just let it be that the court makes a ruling and everybody starts obeying it immediately, because you don't have enabling legislation for that to happen. So Amy Coney Barrett represents that what I call traditional, and some call it constructionist, but it's really a constitutional approach to the government that says that each branch of government has to stay in its own lane. And the court is there only to interpret whether a law is consistent with the Constitution. Does not have the power to take a screwdriver, a hammer, and go in and fix it and make it what it should be. They can only say what it should be, but then it's up to the Congress to actually do it. And that was so refreshing to see her clearly espouse that.
The Democrats have floated the idea of packing the courts, and Vice President Biden has not ruled it out. Why is that a problem?
Well, the reason the Democrats, and when they use the term packing, I think people may misunderstand. I mean, Democrats have tried to say, oh, packing, like Donald Trump put 3 people on the court. That isn't packing. That's appointing under the current system. He had the constitutional duty, not just right. He had the duty to do it, and he did it. Packing really means restructuring the court. It means going from 9 justices, since we've had since 1869, to try to add maybe up to 15 justices. Well, the reason the Democrats want to do this is because they now see that the court could end up becoming a traditional judicial branch where the justices, I'm going to be very clear here, Bjarte, because I think some people say, oh, you want a conservative court. I've argued, no, I don't want a conservative court, but I don't want a liberal court. I just want an objective constitutional court. I don't want them making decisions that lean to the right. I want them to make decisions that lean to the Constitution solely and exclusively. So if you have a court that goes back to this traditional sense of we don't make law, we don't tell people what they have to do, we tell the legislature what it ought to do, the Democrats don't like that because they've depended upon the courts to create out of thin air what they did not have the guts or the votes to do in Congress. That's why we have Roe versus Wade, the abortion decision. There's nothing in the Constitution about abortion. So the Constitution says if it's not written, the states have the right to make the decision. So how was it that in 1973 the court came up with this? Because there were people who wanted it to be legislated. They couldn't get it done, so they took it to the court. Getting rid of prayer and Bible reading in public places and in schools. How did that happen? It happened because the courts imposed that decision on the people without congressional approval. We could even use the same-sex marriage argument. And if somebody says, well, I believe in same-sex marriage, okay, then go through the legislative process and have the legislature approved that, changed the definition of marriage at the state level because it's a state's issue, not a federal, and then let the executive branch sign it. But what happened was the court took it away from the legislature and decided on its own, and now you have people believing that same-sex marriage is legal in the United States. And frankly, if one looked at it very strictly, that was imposed by the court. It was not something that the people's elected representatives chose to do.
In 2016, Donald Trump received 81% of the so-called white evangelical vote, and his numbers are expected to be around the same, maybe even higher this time. Why is he so popular with the evangelicals?
It's, I guess, maybe a real enigma to a lot of people because he's not a religious person maybe by nature. And so people are stunned by it, and they even say, you Christians, you say character matters. Well, it does. And yes, we'd all love for Donald Trump to sit among us in the pews every Sunday and pray honest, sincere prayers. I've said to his face in a room of 1,200 people that I wasn't sure he could find John 3:16 in a Mark New Testament, because I don't pretend that he is one of us as evangelicals. But what I will say without any hesitation is that for the things that matter to me as an evangelical, the right to life, support of Israel, because that's scriptural, religious liberty, just for the government to leave me alone and let me worship as I please, those are critical issues for me as a believer. And this is a president who, more than any other, including even wonderful presidents like Ronald Reagan, but even more, this president has stood for life. He stood for Israel. He stood for a real sense of protecting religious liberty and letting churches freely worship and not trying to have the government come in and dictate when we could worship, how we could worship, and be assessed for taxes for our worship. This is incredibly significant. He's also been a president that has led in something that for many of us as Christian believers mattered, and that was criminal justice reform, a system that was based on both mercy and justice. There were many people incarcerated in the United States for crimes that did not deserve long incarceration, but they were poor. They were often minority. And so as a result, they didn't have the best legal representation. And some poor and black individuals went to prison for long periods of time for nonviolent crimes for which upper rich white people would never have seen a day of incarceration. Now, you'd think that the Democrats, the left, would have fixed this. They didn't. They could have. They just never did. This president actually went in and passed the First Step Act. I worked on that with a number of other people, and I was just so proud of this president for taking on this very significant reform that has transformed the lives of many people and given people back their freedom and has really, I think, maybe respected and recognized that our criminal justice system had failed in many ways. As my prison director during my tenure as governor used to say, we're locking up a lot of people we're mad at rather than the ones that we're actually afraid of. And I thought that summed it up best. And this president made that reform. He does not get the credit that he deserves for it. But as a Christian, having a criminal justice system that includes mercy and restoration is very, very important.
A Norwegian newspaper surveyed several Christian leaders and pastors recently, and they heavily favored Joe Biden if they were to choose in your election. What would be your message to Norwegian pastors? You were a pastor yourself for many years.
Yeah. I would ask them, on what basis? Is it because Joe Biden favors abortion up to the moment of birth? And he also favors that the taxpayer should fund that? How could I, as a Christian believer, ever uh, justify a support for a person who believes that it is okay to take the life of the unborn child, even up to the moment the child is born, and then to say to all those taxpayers, many of whom, like me, have a strong conscience against it, that I must pay for that? How is it that they would support the Biden plan, which was during his time with President Obama, to force the Catholic charity, the Little Sisters of the Poor, to provide birth control and abortion services to the nuns? Now, think about how ridiculous that is. To say to unmarried nuns, most of whom were in their 60s, that they were going to be forced to pay in their insurance plan for birth control and abortion. First of all, medically, it probably would never be necessitated. And secondly, morally, it's an offense to the very vows that these nuns have taken. Then I would say, how do you square that with the corruption that we've seen? His son gets multi-billion-dollar contracts with China and Russia and the Ukraine. Those are scandalous things. People can say whatever they want, but can you imagine the outrage if Eric Trump had been getting side deals with China and Russia and the Ukraine and personally pocketing millions and millions of dollars? If they say, well, President Trump has a rather maybe gruff personality, he's abrasive. Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but Joe Biden is not exactly the Mr. Clean. He's famously caught on a microphone during the Obamacare debate saying to the president a word of praise using one of the most offensive expletives ever. So this idea that somehow he's so very polite and doesn't speak unkindly on national television during a debate, he called the sitting president a clown, a liar, and told him to shut up. So when I hear people say, I'm a pastor and I love the Bible and God, but I'm going to vote for Joe Biden, look, that's your political right to do it. But please don't tell me that there's something spiritual behind it, because there is a lot to be concerned in that Joe Biden does not recognize what I spoke of earlier, the spiritual battle in America, and the fact that you have people who believe you can take to the streets and burn down stores, kill police officers in cold blood because you don't like the way something happened. Well, many of us believe that the proper way to right a wrong is to go through the courts, go through the structure of government. We have the ability to get things changed. We have the ability to make wrong things right, but there is a system to do it. And it does not involve taking the law into my own hands and lynching people. We have a horrible history when we've seen that happen. And you don't defeat racism by burning up a police car and spitting on police officers and then burning down and looting a store that has nothing to do with what you're upset about. That's what's so really disturbing.
From time to time, we see videos on YouTube and elsewhere where Christian pastors and worship leaders and Christian leaders are in the White House with the president, praying for him, having conversations with him or Vice President Pence. Describe that dynamic and how that differs from past presidents.
Most presidents in the past, I think, they used the evangelical community. They would tell them what they wanted to hear, but they never did anything about it. And let me be very blunt and candid. George W. Bush was a personal friend. We were governors together. I knew him very well. I like him, still like him. Good man. But in his administration, while during the campaign, he would promise that he was one of us and with us on issues like life and marriage, quite frankly, never did anything of consequences of great significance. And it is, as it turns out, many of the people in his administration were openly for same-sex marriage and openly for abortion. So part of the reason that nothing ever really happened under his administration was that he was surrounded by people who didn't necessarily agree with the positions that he took to get our votes. Donald Trump has been very different. His conviction on right to life is quite sincere and heartfelt. As I said, I don't pretend that he is one of us, but he respects us. And one of the things that has been most, I guess, really satisfying to me is that this president, I think, is overwhelmed by the unconditional love that he has received from many of those Christian leaders. It's something he's never known in his life. You know, he didn't grow up with it. He didn't have it in his home. He's not had it in his larger family. It's not something that is a part of his nature. He didn't have it in his New York real estate environment. And when I see him and I watch him, I can see in his face that sense of, wow, you know, these people, it's not that they're demanding of me, and it's not that there's a quid pro quo. They are genuinely praying for me, and they're loving me, not because of things I've done that please them, but because they love me unconditionally. And I really think that's had an impact on the president.
Governor Huckabee, you love Israel. That's no secret. And you've done a lot for Israel, and you even came to Norway to receive the Christensen Award because of that. How would you describe President Trump's policy toward Israel?
It's been the most amazing, and it far has exceeded what I was expecting from him. I know that he was saying all along, I support Israel. But let's just tick off some things that he's done. He first recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That was significant, and he did it during the 50th anniversary of the reclaiming of Jerusalem as the nation's capital. Then he moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He recognized the right of Israel over the Golan Heights, which was part of the birthright going all the way back to Abraham. And then he negotiated the Abraham Accords, which is stunning in that you now have Arab countries, the UAE, Bahrain, others are on the way, I can assure you, who now recognize Israel's rightful place to exist, have reestablished diplomatic relations, travel and trade. And this is something that most people would never have believed possible. We're going to see more of the Muslim countries recognizing Israel is not really their threat, it's not their enemy. And these things happen because the president didn't do things the way they'd always been done. He did them the way that were instinctive, intuitive to him. And frankly, it's been pretty incredible that they've worked.
Finally, Governor, with 2 weeks remaining till the election, do you have a prediction for this election?
In 2016, I predicted that President Trump, then Donald Trump, the candidate, I predicted he would win. And I was laughed at, sneered at, scoffed at by many of my fellow Fox News contributors and anchors because they just continued to believe there was no way that he could win. I think he's going to win this time. I know that that goes against what everyone sees in the polls, but it goes against what every poll said 4 years ago. I see no enthusiasm whatsoever for Joe Biden. There is really strong enthusiasm against Donald Trump. A lot of people hate him. I mean, really hate him. They don't just dislike him. They don't want to just see him out of office. They hate him. But their vote is not a vote for Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. Their vote is against Donald Trump. But I don't see that being as equal to the sort of motivating factor that I see for the people who do support President Trump. I think it's going to be a big surprise on election night. And I could be wrong. I mean, it may be. But I'm going to be very clear. If it turns out that Joe Biden wins, as much as I think that'll be detrimental to the country and the world, I'm not going to do what the left has done for 4 years and spend my next 4 years denying the results of the election and trying to overturn the results of an election, because once we start that pattern, we ultimately destroy our system of an elected government. And we will end up with something far worse than having elected a person we don't like. We will end up having somebody as a dictator and a tyrant over us that we can't live with. And that would be a real shame, to lose our system of self-government.
Governor Huckabee, thank you so much for coming on our show. We consider you a friend of Norway now, with 2 visits and being on our show. We'd love to have you back, both on our show and indeed as a guest to our country.
I look forward to it. I truly do. Thank you, and God bless. Great to be with you.
Thank you, sir.